It's funny how we think we have public figures all figured out. Like we see a post on social media, a headline here or there, and we think, yeah, I've got him pegged.
Right. It's like we build these narratives around them, and it can be pretty jarring when they do something that completely throws us off script.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today, this whole idea of public perception versus private journeys, all through the lens of Shaun King's recent conversion to Islam.
Yeah, it's definitely a fascinating case study, especially with someone like King, someone who's built a career on, well, let's be honest, very strong opinions. Opinions that have landed him in hot water just as often as they've propelled him forward as an activist. So to see him make such a public declaration of faith, it makes you wonder about those internal shifts, right? What's driving this?
And it's not just a quiet conversion either. This wasn't just him like whispering a prayer in private. He went all in, reciting the Shahada, the Muslim Declaration of Faith, at the Valley Ranch Islamic Center in Texas.
Oh, wow. And with Imam Omar Suleiman there. That's pretty significant. I mean, that's not just some symbolic gesture. The Shahada, it holds a lot of weight in Islam. It's like this transformative act, kind of wiping the slate clean, a chance for a fresh start. It makes you think about those universal themes of redemption, new beginnings, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And King himself has connected this conversion to his activism, specifically his recent focus on the Palestinian cause. I mean, he's been very vocal about the impact the faith of Palestinians has had on him.
See, this is where things get really interesting because it brings up all sorts of questions. Is this a purely spiritual awakening for him? Or are there other factors intertwined here? Maybe his activism, seeking a sense of community? It's tricky, and there are no easy answers, but it's worth exploring those complexities.
Absolutely. And to really dig into those complexities, we need to back up a bit, provide some context for those who might not be familiar with this full story. So Shaun King first stepped into the spotlight as a pastor.
Right, and it wasn't long before he became a prominent voice in the Black Lives Matter movement. Remember after Charlottesville when he used his tech skills to help identify those white supremacists? That was huge. The guy understands the power of digital platforms, that's for sure.
Oh, for sure. He knows how to mobilize people online, raise funds, bring attention to causes he believes in. Whether you agree with his methods or not, he's changed the game when it comes to modern-day activism.
Yeah.
But let's circle back to this conversion, this public declaration, and his connection to the Palestinian people, especially during this recent conflict with Israel.
Well, you have to remember King is someone who, well, he kind of thrives in the middle of complex conversations, often controversial ones. This isn't new territory for him. He leans into it.
And he's definitely had his fair share of controversy even before this. Remember a few years back when he called for images of a white Jesus to be removed from churches?
Yeah, that was a whole thing. He argued that they perpetuated white supremacy. Classic King, right? Framing things in very black and white terms. It's incredibly effective at mobilizing his base, but also makes him, well, kind of a lightning rod for criticism. You're either with him or you're against him.
That seems to be a recurring theme. And then there's the whole fundraising aspect of his work. It seems like with every cause, there's a call for donations. We saw it with his activism, with his efforts to revive Frederick Douglass's newspaper, The North Star, and even with that, a Real One clothing line.
Yeah, and with the fundraising, it's like this weird mix of praise and criticism. On the one hand, you can't deny his passion, and he has directed significant funds towards these causes, but then there's this consistent murmuring about transparency, projects not quite coming to fruition, and questions about how those funds are managed.
A Real One clothing line is a perfect example. People were all in, excited to support it. Then a lot of folks didn't receive their orders, and it left a sour taste. And of course, there's the Grassroots Law Project, which he founded. They raised millions after George Floyd's murder, but then that Daily Beast investigation raised some eyebrows about how that money was used.
Right. They claimed King and his associates were pulling in big salaries, and the organization's impact on its stated goals was questionable. Now, in the spirit of fairness, we should mention that the Grassroots Law Project has strongly denied these accusations. They call the investigation misleading, but it does highlight that fine line King walks between genuine activism and, well, accusations of personal gain. It's tricky.
It feels like he's perpetually caught in this push and pull between being seen as this passionate advocate, pushing boundaries, and then others who are much more suspicious of his motives. And throwing this conversion to Islam into the mix, especially the backdrop of the Israel-Hamas conflict, it's just amplified those existing tensions.
Exactly, and that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating to unpack. We aren't just talking about one man's spiritual journey here. We're talking about the intersection of faith, activism, identity politics, and how we grapple with truth and accountability in our digital world. It's a lot.
It is a lot to unpack, and unpack it we shall. So let's dive into how King's recent actions, particularly those surrounding the Israel-Hamas conflict, play into all of this, because the timing is, well, it's hard to ignore. Yeah, it's like this whole perfect storm he's created, or maybe gotten swept up in, I don't know.
Yeah.
But you mentioned how deeply involved he's been with this Israel-Hamas conflict, even going so far as to file a lawsuit against Meta.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He's going after Instagram's parent company, claiming that they banned him, right, specifically because of his stance on the whole Israel-Palestine thing, saying it was after he posted that letter, an open letter even, thanking the, and I quote here, men of Yemen. He said they were working to stop the, quote, genocide of the Palestinian people.
And this was all happening around the same time as those attacks on the commercial ships out there in the Red Sea, the ones everyone was saying were the Houthi rebels.
Right.
Which, if you need a little geopolitical catch-up, they're backed by Iran, based in Yemen.
Exactly. And that's where the whole thing just gets more and more tangled. Because depending on who you ask, who you listen to, King's either standing up for a totally legit resistance, you know, fighting the good fight, or he's aligned with, well, terrorists, is what a lot of folks would say. And this is where that King tendency comes in, right? He's got this way of taking these crazy, complicated, global things, situations where nobody can agree on the good guys and the bad guys even, and suddenly it's black and white, good versus evil.
Yeah, it's like a pattern with him, isn't it? We saw it with that whole white Jesus debate. Yeah. Pops up again with the fundraising.
Right.
And now it's front and center with this Israel-Hamas conflict. I get it. It gets people fired up, gets them on his side. But at the same time, it makes it almost impossible to have any kind of, I don't know, a reasonable conversation, anything with nuance about this stuff.
Oh, it's like he's taking these huge global events, these things with centuries of history behind them, and boiling them down to like what fits in a tweet. And I'm not saying he's the only one, but it makes it tough to get past the emotional stuff and into like the real nitty-gritty details, you know? But we were talking about his actual actions, right?
Exactly.
So beyond the online stuff, King's been seriously involved in raising money, trying to get it directly to families over in Gaza, saying that's where it's needed most. And his social media, forget about it, it's been nonstop coverage of the conflict, pretty harsh criticism of Israel's actions too.
And then, of course, there's that whole situation. Can't talk about King in this conflict without mentioning Judith and Natalie Rananan, that American mother and daughter, right?
Yeah.
The ones taken hostage by Hamas. I mean, King went public saying he was part of why they got released, working frantically, that was his word, behind the scenes.
Which, and we have to say this, the Rekindled family completely denied, like completely. They said he was straight up lying about helping, that he was using their family story, this awful thing they'd been through, to make himself look better, to make it seem like even they agreed with him on Israel. It was a mess.
A total mess. King shot back, saying he'd been talking to one of the hostages' brothers, but the family was like, nope, don't know him, never spoke to him. And suddenly you've got this very public, very nasty back and forth accusations flying every which way. And honestly, it just makes you wonder, in this day and age when everyone's got a platform, when you can say anything and there's a good chance it'll be seen by thousands, millions of people, how are we supposed to figure out what's actually true anymore?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's one we just keep bumping into with someone like Shaun King. There's this undeniable passion there, right? This genuine desire to fight for social justice. I think most people would agree with that. But then there's also this, I don't know, this need to be right in the thick of it, to be the hero, the savior. And those two things, they're not always so easy to separate.
And that's what makes this whole conversion thing so fascinating to me, so thought-provoking. Because is this a real, genuine shift in his beliefs? A true come-to-Jesus moment, so to speak? Or is it another one of these stories, carefully crafted, maybe unconsciously, who knows, to keep those donations coming in, to stay relevant, to see his name up in lights?
Honestly, it's impossible to say for sure. But what we can do, what's worth doing, is looking at how this conversion thing lines up with everything else we know. His activism, all those past controversies, the whole way he uses the internet, uses social media as his platform. We've got to consider all of it if we want to even begin to understand what this latest chapter, this conversion to Islam, really means in the bigger picture of Shaun King.
It really does feel like all these different pieces of him, of his story, are colliding right now.
Yeah.
You've got this guy, always been an activist, right? But lately, it's all Palestine, all the time. Then there's the money stuff, people wondering what's really going on there, if he's being honest about it all. And now, boom, he's Muslim. And it's not like that's just a personal thing these days, is it? Not with everything going on in the world.
No, not at all. I mean, you're right. It's a lot to process. And whether you agree with Shaun King, whether you like the guy or not, you got to admit, His story, it brings up some really uncomfortable stuff, some hard truths about, well, about how we operate these days as a society.
Okay, so lay it on me.
Yeah.
What are those uncomfortable truths? We've been going pretty deep on this guy, on this conversion. What's the takeaway here?
Well, for me, one of the biggest ones, it's got to be the power of online activism, right? The good and the bad that come with it. I mean, King, he built his entire career on social media, right? Getting people fired up, raising money, that's how he operates. But that same platform, it's also opened him up to a whole other level of scrutiny, fueled the fire when those accusations came out. It's like this double-edged sword. And I think a lot of activists, especially these days, they're trying to figure out how to use it without getting cut.
It makes you think about how important it is for all of us to be more critical about what we see online,
Yeah.
especially when it's something that already fits into our worldview, something we already want to believe. It's easy to hit that like button to share without thinking, but
Absolutely. We need to be more discerning, especially now with all the misinformation flying around. And then there's the whole identity piece of this. King becoming Muslim, especially now, against the backdrop of everything happening with Israel and Palestine, well, it's created a very specific type of reaction, hasn't it?
it really has. Some people, they see it as a real act of solidarity, putting his money where his mouth is, so to speak. Others, well, they think it's a calculated move, a way to stay relevant, to tap into this, I don't know, this wave of support for Palestine.
That's it exactly. It's like we can't help ourselves. We put people, especially public figures, into these neat little boxes, hero or villain, and we kind of force them to fit. And that, to me, that's a big part of the problem. We oversimplify these really complex issues, these messy human stories, and in the process, we lose all the nuance, the contradictions, the things that actually make us human.
So where does that leave us? What's the question we should be asking ourselves after spending all this time with Shaun King, with this whole conversion thing?
You know, the question that keeps coming back to me is, will this actually change anything? Will it lead to more understanding, maybe some bridge building? Or is this just another chapter in the Shaun King show, full of sound and fury, but not really changing anything in the long run?
I guess only time will tell. But one thing's for sure. This guy, he's not going anywhere anytime soon. And his story, messy as it might be, well, it forces us to confront some really important stuff about faith, about activism, about how we figure out what's true in a world where anyone can say anything and have it amplified a million times over.
And those are conversations worth having. They might be messy, might be uncomfortable, but it's by wrestling with these ideas that we actually grow, both as individuals and as a society.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we're going to leave you to ponder the possibilities. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.